All right. I'm glad everyone was able to join today. This is going to be my presentation about building an ON18 micro layout. And this will be an overview of the Ute Creek micro layout. This will be the agenda for the presentation. We'll go over the concept and inspiration behind the layout. We'll cover the track plan and operational features, the rolling stock and the equipment for the layout, structures and detailing techniques, scenery, the latest updates, and the costs involved. So chapter 1 is the concept and inspiration behind this micro layout. Now I've had previous model railroading experience. 30 years ago, I built an HO layout in my basement that's still there. More recently, I built an N-scale 2x4 layout for the Model Railroad Club that I'm involved in. And I've been constantly building structures all this time, which is what I enjoy doing the most. But during all that time, I hadn't learned very much about narrow gauge railroading, so I had to do some research. I knew that narrow gauge railroads were very prolific in the 19th century, and they were used for both transportation and industrial needs. And I've always loved this photo of a standard gauge steam loco next to a narrow gauge locomotive with the narrow gauge boxcars next to it. One of the first decisions that I had to make was what I wanted my micro layout to be. I didn't want it for transportation purposes, so industrial was the way to go. But what industry could I pick? I could do a logging railroad like they had in Maine or the Pacific Northwest. I could do a coal operation like the East Broad Top, or I could create a mining railroad that was common in Colorado and the American Southwest. Some of the other origins of my layout idea were because I had friends who were also building narrow gauge railroads. And I also had an increasing interest in the gold mining history in the Southwest US. And I knew that for my micro layout, whatever theme I used, I wanted to have some type of bridge on it. And this would obviously be something that wasn't a major construction because narrow gauge railroads rarely did that. So it was either going to be some kind of dry wash or a little creek or something. And I knew that what I built for my micro layout was going to be ON18. And that's O-scale equipment on N-gauge track, which scales out to 18 inches. Now here's some of the items that I had to work with. And I had gotten all of these from my friend Steve Sherrill. I had a piece of 2x2 XPS foam, which was 1 inch thick. I had a box of HOE flex track, which is 9mm, similar to N-gauge track. I also had some 9mm sectional track, a couple of Lambert turnouts, and I had a 3D printed shay and caboose from Carroll Creek Design. Now, what is a micro layout? At its heart, it's a layout that can offer narrow gauge or standard gauge in a compact but fully functional model railroad experience. They're very often 4 feet square or smaller, but they still provide a clear purpose and an operational capability. They can handle different themes, such as industrial or mining, and they can feature elements like narrow gauge or unique locales. They're perfect for those with a limited space or looking to explore narrow gauge modeling on a smaller scale, or who want a layout that is easily transportable. Now, my first indoctrination into the world of micro layouts was at the Micro Madness meet in January of 2025. And this was put on by Steve Sherrill and Ryan Vegas. And Steve asked me to come up and see what it was all about. Now, these are some of the layouts that were at the micro meet. And you can see they encompass all types of locales, all types of track layouts, and all sorts of scales and gauges. And I had also run into a few micro layouts previously, but I hadn't really been paying attention to them. I've attended the Harrisburg Narrow O-Scale show for a number of years representing new tracks modeling. The first year I went was 2022. And you can track my interest in narrow gauge and micro layouts through the photos that I took each year as I went. The first year I was there, I was mostly taking photographs of the show and of my friends and fellow dealers who were up there. 2023, I was still taking photos of the shows, but I was starting to notice these small layouts that people were setting up and running trains on. By 2024, I was noticing more and more of the micro layouts. And then by 2025, that's what my entire focus was on. I took photos of all the micro layouts I could find up there. I was becoming totally enthralled by them and the possibilities that they offer. And I had even taken the very beginnings of the layout that I was working on up there to show some of my friends. And I also had picked up a couple of narrow gauge items while at the show, and this was the first time I had ever bought anything for narrow gauge. I also brought home a couple of books talking about narrow gauge railroading. Some of the other inspiration for my layout were from Dave Meek's Thunder Mesa studio. And I've been watching him on YouTube for years, creating many of his layouts that are narrow gauge and take place in the American Southwest. And also, much of my inspiration was from watching Westerns as I grew up, especially John Ford's Westerns that he tended to set in Monument Valley. And I learned a lot about that from reading the book Company of Heroes years ago by Harry Carey Jr., where he talked about being an actor in the John Ford Stock Company. And like many people my age, I grew up on Looney Tune cartoons, and the Roadrunner and Coyote were some of my favorites. So some of the design goals that I had were that it had to be easily transportable. It had to be lightweight with everything securely attached, except for stuff that could be easily boxed up and taken along. It had to be able to run with or without power. You can't always count on having a wall outlet nearby, and that means either running dead rail or dual power power pack. And dead rail is when you have the battery and a receiver inside the locomotive or a tender, so you don't need any power on the tracks. And I also wanted to have a gold mine infrastructure representation. And that meant that it would show some of the elements of ON18 scale modeling, as well as embracing the whimsy of micro layouts. So I had to start working on a track plan for this. And as I said, these are the items that I had gotten from Steve Sherrill. And I had to figure out how to fit a track plan on a 2x2 foot square. Now I knew I could go down to an 8-inch radius curve, even though I was using O-scale equipment. And I got out my old radius gauge from when I built my layout, and I tried putting an oval in the middle of the square. And it turns out that's very uninspiring. I played with a couple other shapes, such as an egg shape but I didn't like the way anything was really coming out. And then I remembered from building a number of dioramas that it's often interesting to have the building set at an angle. So I thought maybe I could do that with my track plan. And that seemed to work out pretty well. So I was happy with that. So I started pinning down my track, following the track layout that I had put down. And I had to decide if I wanted to use one or both turnouts, or if I wanted to have a re-railer put in place, keeping in mind that O-scale equipment with N-scale trucks underneath them makes it difficult to re-rail equipment. And I finally settled on just one turnout. Now I knew that for those kind of curves, I was going to have to solder my track together. So I brought a few of the pieces of the flex track to my workbench, removed a few of the ties, put on the rail joiners, and went ahead and soldered them together. And I went back and pinned those down to the piece of foam and ran my truck through it. And it felt very smooth. So that test went well. The next thing I needed to do was attach feeders to the bottom of the rails. And that went simple. I knew I was only going to need one set of feeders because there wasn't that much track. And I was going to feed them down into the foam and have them come out the side. So then I went to test, and I used my Kato 11109 drive, which is very often used for N-gauge track. I had forgotten that my little power pack had broken, and when you first move the lever, it goes from 0 to 100% immediately. So, of course, my little Kato drive went flying off the end of the track onto the concrete floor. Fortunately, it just bounced a little bit, and it was still working just fine. So I took the track back out to the piece of foam, and I cut the pocket for where the feeders were going to go. Then I started gluing the track down. I'd use the pins to create the curve, and then I'd go ahead and slide some tight bond underneath the track and then weight it down with some weights. And I just worked my way around the entire oval doing that. And it really didn't take very long. And I got to the point where all of my track was down and all I had to put in place was the turnout. I also cut out the dry wash that I wanted in place, and I used a couple pieces of 6x6 to act as the timber support, and I just laid the track going over that. So at that point, the track laying was done. Now I moved on to the rail equipment. This is the rolling stock and equipment for the layout. So as I said, I had a Kato drive unit, plus I'd gotten a caboose and a Shea body from Steve. They were both from Carroll Creek Design. The first thing I started on was the caboose, and I had a choice of two different sets of trucks that I could use for it. I had some 3D printed ones that were the correct scale, but I had some N scale trucks as well. And I liked the 3D printed ones better, but I did have to sand the bottoms of the frames for them to be able to roll along on the track. So I first painted the caboose using a German red-brown primer, and then I brush painted all of the other pieces of it that weren't going to be that color. And I started adding stuff such as the couplers. I was going to be using Lincoln pin for those, as well as some stirrups and a couple other details. Then I went ahead and assembled the caboose and weathered it. Then for the locomotive, it was very simple after I went ahead and added the pins for the couplers because the chassis was just a press fit onto the Kato drive. And then the structure just fits on top of the chassis. Now, like I said, I had also picked up a couple of narrow gauge items at the Harrisburg show, and these were ore cars that again went together very simply. And I went ahead and painted them the same red-brown, and that was going to remain their color. And then I used some brown paint and some Activa and spread that on the inside of the ore cars just to look like leftover ore from hauling them. And to make the fleet look like it was a little bigger than the two cars I had, I went ahead and added some numbers to the cars. Then I weathered them along with the Loco, and I used oil paints and some pan pastels for weathering it. Now, the links that I was using were just simple little pieces of plastic, but to make them look a little more interesting and not like a piece of plastic, I added some NBW castings to them and went ahead and weathered them as well. So next up, it was time to work on the structures for the layout. Now, while I was at the 2025 Harrisburg show, I met Calvin Witt. He had flown in from California with a lot of his laser cut buildings that he sells. And he had this O-scale blacksmith shop for just $5. And I said, that'll make a perfect office for my railroad. And I couldn't pass up that price. And I also picked up a mine entrance that he was selling as well. Now this shows you what came in that blacksmith shop. It's some laser cut walls along with some laser cut details for trim and doors, as well as some tissue windows and cardstock for the roof. And I went ahead and distressed the wood and then stained it some. And I painted the laser cut details and trim with a parchment paint that I thinned down a little bit to make it look like worn paint. Then I just did standard laser cut assembly on this, gluing the walls together, and I had made a sign for it that named my railroad. And I weathered up and dirtied up the windows and glued them in place, and then glued the roof in place, added a couple of supports for the false front, and then weathered the building. Now, I liked his structure so much that I went to his Etsy site where he sells all of his products and ordered another package of his tool sheds. And with this, you get 2 buildings in one package for $16 with free shipping. And again, it comes with all the parts that you need to build 2 of these sheds. So I went ahead and distressed the wood and stained it and put it together like the other one, even busting out a window and boarding over it. And then for this one, I rusted up some corrugated panel that I had and used that for the roofing. And then went ahead and weathered this building as well. So now I have my office and my work shed for the layout. So where are we so far? We have our track down and ready to run. We have our rail equipment all done. And we have our structures built. So at this point, you'd think we're almost done, right? Well, it doesn't quite look like my vision yet. So we need to move on to the scenery, which is a large part of micro layouts. So chapter 5 would deal with the scenery. And some of my primary inspiration was from Steve Sherrill who's a master of narrow gauge and micro layouts, as well as dead rail, and also Andy Root, who I've met at a number of micro layout shows, as well as Harrisburg, and he's built the famous Gopher Canyon layout, which is also set in the American Southwest and is a mining theme. And I also got more inspiration from Alex Belida. Now, he has an HO scale Eureka and South Pass Railroad that represents Nevada in the late 1800s, and it also contains a couple of mines on it. Some of the other inspiration was just the images of the Southwest that I've also always found fascinating. And watching some of the Thunder Mesa studio videos where he shows what can actually be done to create the scenery for Southwest layouts. So I knew that I wanted a gold mine, but I had to discover my mine. And doing some research online, I made the discovery that I had been looking for. And this was the French Henry Mine, located in New Mexico. And this shows the location of it, along with a photo of the couple of the buildings from the late 1800s, as well as one of the buildings, the way it stands when the photo was taken in the late 70s, 1970s. Now, a little history of the mine was that it was discovered in 1869 by Henry Bruhl, and he obtained the deed to it from Lucian Maxwell. And they started mining in 1870. And they were going to be using these ore carts that you see here to haul the ore from the mine to the stamp mill. But they had to halt very soon because Maxwell's nearby stamp mill wasn't going to process the ore for them anymore. And taking the ore in those ore wagons to any other stamp mill would have been too expensive and too time-consuming. So I came to their rescue. I built a railroad from the French Henry Mine along the Ute Creek down to the stamp mill that was located on Cimarron River. Now, the actual French Henry Mine got back into production by making an agreement with closer stamp mills, but that was later on in their lifespan. And some of the info that I got about these mines were from the New Mexico Geological Society and also from a 1910 book talking about the ore deposits of New Mexico, where it also goes into detail about the French Henry Mine. But I did have to make a slight tweak in the landscape of my layout, and that's because I knew that I wanted to have that imaginative scenery from Monument Valley with all of the mesas and buttes. But the French Henry Mine was a little too far east for that. And so I just moved it a little bit to the northwest, and that allowed me to have all the landscape that I wanted. And a fun fact, the difference between a mesa and a butte is that a mesa is wider than it is tall, and a butte is taller than it is wide. So moving back to the layout, I took it outside and spray painted the track and the ties with a camouflage brown. And then I used a cork and some mineral spirits to clean off the tops of the rails before the paint had dried. And I went ahead and used the sectional track and ran that off of the turnout and painted it as well. So this was kind of my idea of having a large mesa in the middle of the layout with the mine in it, and the tracks would be going to the location of the mine. One of the things that Steve Sherrill had always told me is on a micro layout, if you can have the train hidden for part of its travel, it makes a layout look bigger. It makes the train looks like it's going somewhere and coming from somewhere. So my mesa in the middle of the micro layout was going to do that. Now, during this time, I also picked up a throttle, and this is a dual power throttle that can be plugged into a wall outlet, but also run off of AAA batteries. And I had also picked up a hot knife to help cut the foam down into more manageable pieces. I was lucky that I still had a lot of large pieces of foam left over from when I built my layout 30 years ago. But carving them down to the size of the mountains that I was going to be making was easier with the hot knife. And then I could stack them up and kind of get a vision of what they were going to look like. Now, some of the techniques that I had learned from watching Dave Meeks was that you can use a utility knife to dig out small chunks along the sides and then a wire brush to create the strata lines. And I was able to see how this was possible that it could work. I'd carved all the strata lines in the lower piece and painted it, and you can see with the piece setting on top of it how it really makes it look like some of the rock work in Monument Valley. I'd also picked up a heat gun, and this does two things when you're working on the foam like this. It removes all the fuzzies that tend to come up when you're using a wire brush, and it also hardens all the edges so they're not quite as soft after you've been digging into the foam. So I started putting some of my pieces together to make mountains out of them. And I use liquid nails for doing that. I used it when I was putting the pieces of foam together on my layout decades ago, and it's never let go. And I started testing the placement of some of the mountains that I had created to see how they'd go there. And when I was happy with those and with the clearance that they gave me, I went ahead and glued them in place, again using liquid nails. And then I used weights to hold them down while the glue was curing. Next, I started working on the center mesa. And you can see, again, I was just building it up from pieces that I had cut down. And I started carving my strata into the pieces of foam as I put them together. And then once I glued all of them together, I test fit it on the layout, again, to make sure that I had all the clearance I needed. And once I was sure I did, I glued it down. But I had one thing that I had to change, and that was the dry gulch that I had put in. It ran too close to the mountain. So I just cut a new portion of it and filled in the old part with Sculptamold. Now, one of the other things that I had gotten at the show was the mine entrance. And this was a set of pieces that were two sides and a roof that got glued to the supports. And then it had a cast resin backing that went on the back of the mine once it was put in place. So I had glued that into the opening in my center mesa, and I went ahead and filled around the front of it with more Sculptamold. Then I went ahead and did clearance testing just to make sure everything would fit and I wouldn't have any problems with clearance. Now I went ahead and used more Sculptamold to blend the mountains into the layout itself. And if you've seen photos of these type of mesas in Monument Valley, you know that they have a very large talus slope. And that's why they're created, is all the rock has fallen down and collected at the base of them. The next thing I started doing was putting down a base coat for my mountains. And I had printed out quite a few photos of the type of coloring that I was after. And I used raw sienna to paint one of my mountains as a base coat to see how that was going to look once it dried. And I was happy with it. So now it was time to go ahead and cover up all of my track and start working on the layout itself. And I used more Sculptamold to create some ridges and some high spots, so it wasn't just a flat piece of foam with some mountains setting on it. And while I was doing that, I went ahead and carved some more strata into my center mesa. Then I went ahead and started painting the rest of my mountains after I had picked up a much larger tube of the raw sienna. And I pretty much covered all of the layout with that color as my base coat. But I went ahead and added some more Sculptamold on the front of the layout just so I'd have more of a rise there. Now, I knew I was going to have some cacti if this was representing the Southwest. So for mini prints, I ordered a saguaro cactus, some prickly pear cactus, and an agave plant. And for the saguaro, I went ahead and drilled a hole in the base of it and then glued a wire into it so they could stick into the foam. Now I took them over to my spray booth and mixed a couple colors of green and went ahead and painted them. And I was lucky that my wife has a couple cacti plants on our deck, and I was able to compare them to those to make sure that I was in the ballpark as far as the color was. And I painted the prickly pear as well, but since they were on a base from having been printed like that, the bases were going to have to be inserted into the layout. So I painted them a sort of red-brown color that I was going to be using on the layout. So I kind of test fit where all of the cacti were going to go. And I had also picked up some yucca and barrel cacti as well. And I just played around with putting things in place. And the only thing that I didn't like was some of the bigger saguaro, even though they were true to scale as far as the size, because they can get monstrously high, they were bigger than I wanted on the layout because they kind of dominated it. So I only used the smallest ones that I had. So now I started painting the rest of the colors that were going to be on my mountains. I had picked up a few other colors to go with all of the paints that I had and mixed them up into a variety of shades of browns, reds, ochres, and then I started brushing them on to the mountains. And I even mixed up a couple colors where I had some desert varnish that I painted in after seeing that on some of the photos that I had. And I knew that I didn't just want to have the plain foam as the texture because that would be too smooth. And I've used sanded grout for some of my dioramas, and I knew that that would give me the texture that I wanted. But unfortunately, the sanded grout that I had was in two shades of tan that weren't going to work for me. So I tried coloring it before I mixed it with the water to put it down, and I used some of my artist pigments that were in the red browns that I wanted. And it worked as far as coloring the grout, but I didn't like the way it was coming out because it was all the same color. There was no variation whatsoever. So I was going to have to figure out something else to do as far as that goes. But I went ahead and put down all of the sanded grout, and I also glued down my prickly pears while I was at it. Now, I wanted to reproduce the collapsed building that I had seen the picture of. So I went ahead and got some building blocks that I have, and I painted them to look like adobe blocks. And then I cut out an area that was going to be the foundation for where I put my collapsed building. And after I glued down the foundation, I started working on the building itself. And I knew that I wanted a warped wall. So I built a wall out of strip wood, even putting a window in it. And once that had dried, I clamped it into my vise and then twisted it with my helping hands. And I just used a brush with water and kept going over it a few times for a couple of days. And by the time I was done, it had dried in the warped shape. So the solution that I found for coloring my sanded grout was just stippling on some of the artist pigments that I had in the colors that I wanted. And that was like the red browns. And the stippling gave me the variation and the color that I had been after. So I was happy that that had come out the way I wanted. So after I did that, I started creating my collapsed building. I put down a bunch of broken pieces of strip wood and some other pieces of corrugated roofing, and then I glued my warped wall on top of it, and that gave me my collapsed building. I also knew that I needed a spoil heap next to the mine entrance. I carved a piece of foam into the rough shape for it. Then I glued on a whole bunch of fine ballast, and I colored that with a really dark wash, and then I sprinkled on some Activa to give it a bit of sparkle. I also went ahead and added a plug to the wires that were coming out of the layout for the track. Now, one of the other things I had picked up at the Harrisburg show was a figure from Les Davis. He 3D prints lots of these. And this was going to be my engineer, and he's named Old Bob. So I went ahead and painted him up, and I put him on the train, on the locomotive. But I had a number of people ask me how he was able to run the locomotive with his hands in his pockets. So I had to come up with a couple of stories to cover that. I went ahead and started adding ballast to the track. And in the desert, for these narrow gauge lines, they just used whatever rocks they could find or rocks that they were digging out as they were mining. So I used some Woodland Scenics talus, and I sorted out the finest talus that they had, and then sprinkled that down onto my track, and I wet it down and held it in place with some scenic cement. Then I came back and used some of the artist pigments and stippled that onto the ballast so that it would have the same coloring as the layout. Then after I did that, I used a fine mister and sprayed everything down, just using water, and that would hold all of the pigments and everything in place. And with that done, I took it to my first show, which was the 20 by 2025 Timonium show. And I put it on the table where I was representing New Tracks modeling. And that drew people over to the table so that I was able to talk to them about New Tracks. But I have to admit, most of the questions were about the layout itself. Then after the show, once I brought it back home, I decided to add some more scenery to it. I had seen enough pictures of creosote bush in the desert that I got a couple of my Martin Welberg products that were similar to that and glued them in place. I'd also picked up a couple more characters. These are proto-people from Alchem scale models. Bernard Kempinski takes photos from the 19th century and scans them into a program called Meshi, where it can generate a 3D rendering of the person in the photograph. And then he's able to 3D print those out. So I took them and went ahead and painted them up and put them on the layout just as workers around the mine. I also added more talus slope around the base of the mountains and the mesa, as I felt it wasn't steep enough and there wasn't enough of it there. And you can see in the middle of this photograph where it's been colored using the pigments on the right-hand side as opposed to the base color of the Woodland Scenics talus on the left. I also picked up some junk and details. I'd gotten an ore cart and a tool bench from Grantline, and some tools and a wash tub and a couple other details from Pacific Northwest. And I glued all of those in place. And I just happened to have a steer skull laying around that I put next to the dry wash. So at that point, I took it to the next Micro Madness meet, which was in 2026. And again, this one was put on by Ryan Vegas and Steve Sherrill. And these are some of the photos of the micro layouts that were at that meet. You can see the wide variety of micro layouts and the kind of whimsy that they can entail. You have everything from industrial to snow scenes to science fiction. And I was really happy that I was able to have my micro layout along with the rest of those. It's a great group to be spending time with. And soon after that was the next ammonium show that I took it up to. And again, it got quite a few nice comments of people asking about it and asking what was ON18 because they had never heard of it. So here are some of the updates that I've done since I got back from that show. While I was at the Micro Madness meet, I picked up a couple more things. I got another Les Davis figure, and I picked up an ore dump wagon from Narrow Gauge Modeling. Now, this was going to be the wagon that they had tried using before the railroad was built. But when they didn't need it anymore, it just got cast aside, and like so many other things in the desert, is just deteriorating. And I also painted up the new figure, and he's going to be Engineer Dan, and he's replacing old Bob on the locomotive. But Bob, having his hands in his pocket, got promoted to the foreman. And he now has a boss who's asking him, how come you're always standing around with your hands in your pockets? I also decided to make a small backdrop for it. I had picked up a piece of terrarium vinyl that's made to go inside a terrarium that had a desert scene on it. And this was only a couple of bucks on Amazon. I also picked up a for rent sign from the hardware store, and I painted it white and cut it down to the same size as the terrarium vinyl and glued the terrarium vinyl onto it and then screwed it onto the back of the layout. So that gives me a backdrop that's easily attached to it and can be removed if I need to. And it really comes in handy for close-up photographs. I also picked up a whistle and bell from Cumberland Shops and installed them on the locomotive along with the pull strings for them. And that's how it was when I took it up to the Harrisburg Narrow O show in June of this year. but I do have some more changes to come. I've got a new bobber caboose on order, along with a boxcar that I'm not sure what I'll use it for yet, but I'll be using it somehow. And I have plans to make the backdrop continue around on the sides a little bit more. So let's take a look at what these cost. Micro layouts don't have to be very expensive. The base for it is just a piece of XPS foam that you can get from Home Depot for under $10. You can buy the large sheets of it that come 4x8, and that's more cost effective if you have use for all of the extra. Now, I had used the HOE track, which is a European version. But if you wanted to get similar track here in the United States, the Pico 9mm track is the closest to it. And for a 36-inch piece of flex track, that costs $12.99 at White Rose Hobbies. If you wanted to get 10 pieces, they're only $10.38 each. The Kato 11109 drive is under $20 on Amazon, and that item is used for many, many micro layouts. The Shea body was 3D printed to fit onto the Kato drive, and that was $55 from Carroll Creek. And the ore hopper cars were $20 from Carroll Creek. And the dual power Rakuhan controller was $56 from Amazon. Now, some of the challenges that I ran into was I had never built a micro layout before, but the building of the layout went easy. Putting down the track went smoothly, and building the mountains was a lot of fun. Now, I didn't know very much about gold mining or about narrow gauge mining operations, but I learned a lot doing research. And that's one of the ideas behind building something, is to learn more about it. But I do still have more to learn about narrow gauge mining. And I picked up a couple new books to me, The Gilpin Gold Train and Narrow Gauge Nostalgia. So I'm very pleased with how the layout came out. And I even have ideas of building a new micro layout. And it's one that I might have a little more knowledge about the background to it, but I won't give away anything until I'm ready to do that. I enjoyed looking up the history of gold mines and narrow gauge mining, and being able to use that along with the whimsy that micro layouts can project. And like I said, I have a few more improvements that I'm going to be adding to this layout over time. So as we ride off into the sunset, let me know if you have any questions.